Good to see you this morning, and as Graham said, my name's David Oakley, and I'm delighted we've managed to sort out the various marriages in our church this morning. Everything's a lot clearer, and just brilliant to see everybody together from both of our sides, worshiping God together. And I've got to be honest, I've enjoyed the boy band this morning. Tom in particular, leading the way with the young boys, brilliant. So thank you so much for coming together for this time of joint site worship. And this morning we want to think particularly about this area of compassion. Last month I was invited to the Suffolk Community Awards. And I was invited, but I didn't win anything, which was a little bit disappointed. But we went along, and it was truly an inspirational afternoon. It was like a couple of hours of different charities who were honored. And one question that was asked of a lady who led one of these charities that received an award was, what should we be doing at this time? And she replied, I think we've just all got to be a lot kinder to each other. That was her answer. She said, that's shaping what our charity are doing. And I was really struck by that. I thought, yeah, you're so right. We just need this little bit of kindness. We need to extend kindness because these are tough days in which we live. Inflation, spiraling, cost of living crisis, war within Europe, and all these various things going on that are impacting us, never mind disease and death and struggles as well. So there's much that can bring us down. But I came away thinking, yeah, I've got to be kinder. But what does that look like? Because as I look at the world and see the needs and see the struggles, it's almost overwhelming, isn't it? There's so much. What can I do? And that's why I've been thrilled that we've been able to turn in our series, Learning from Jesus, that we can start to get some guidelines and insights to help us when we have these compassionate moments, how we can channel it, where it can go, and what can shape that in the face of overwhelming need. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. We've got this series going on that we dip in and out of here at our Westroad site, learning from Jesus, because we think Jesus is brilliant. We think Jesus gives us the insights for a fullness of life and how we can make a difference. And in particular, we want to think about this area of compassion or pity or helping those who are struggling this morning. And three guidelines that emerge from the story we're going to look at is we should show compassion to those who are stuck. Those who are sticking and stuck, we're going to see what that looks like. Secondly, also that sense in which we should show compassion not based on what we've got or what we've not got, but more on what God supplies, which can cause a multiplication, an impact. And thirdly, when we show compassion, let's channel it to those who are sympathetic to the things of God. Because sometimes people kind of reject these things. And so as we're trying to decide where we apply our energies and our resources, sometimes this can be a key factor. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. And we're going to go back into the book of Mark. As Andy, one of my co-leaders, said, I think we've been in the Gospel of Mark now for about 300 years or something like that, as we're working our way systematically through this account of the life of Jesus. Remember, at the beginning of the New Testament, there are 4 accounts about the life, the times, and ministries of Jesus, written by 4 different authors to 4 different audiences in 4 different settings, so that we get a full picture of who this Jesus of Nazareth is. And Mark, in particular, is written for you and for me. Well, pre-Brexit, because it's written for Europeans. It's written for people in Rome at that time in the 1st century. People are at the center of power. So Jesus is presented by Mark not so much as being always compassionate, but he's presented as a person of power. The Roman listeners, they used to seeing power. It was displayed all around their city with Caesar, with their Roman army conquests. And what Mark does, saying, you think Caesar's powerful, you think your human empire is powerful, let me tell you about someone who is more powerful. But not only is he more powerful, there is that compassion and care and love about him as well. And that's what we're going to jump into on Mark chapter 8. If you read through the Gospel of Mark, you'll see a kind of a repetition take place at the end of chapter 6 and chapter 7, leading into chapter 8. There are these amazing feeding miracles where thousands of people are fed by Jesus. He seems to be going backwards and forwards across the Sea of Galilee on the boat. And then he's constantly banging heads against people as they're saying, "Who are you? What are you doing? What's your mission? We don't get what you're about." And there's almost this repetition takes place because of this lack of spiritual understanding. People are struggling to understand, so what is the response? Well, let's repeat the message. Let's repeat who Jesus is, and let's repeat what his mission is so that people might be open to further understanding of what Jesus is doing. So we're jumping into this repetition, if you like, in Mark chapter 8, particularly as we begin to think about this area of compassion and helping those who are stuck. So we read in verses 1 to 2 of Mark 8, "About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, 'I feel sorry for these people.'" About this time. This means we'd have to go back into chapter 7 to see what was going on. And what was going on was Jesus was on a trip. Jesus and his followers, his close friends, the disciples as we call it, they're on a journey together. They spent 80% of their time in the northern part of Israel, in Galilee. But occasionally, Jesus, to expand their mind, to teach them, would take them outside of their comfort zone in the Bible Belt of Galilee and take them to different places. And he took them to Tyre and Sidon, and now he's in a place called Decapolis. Now, this would be similar, if you like, if I said, right, I want all the young people to come with me because I want to teach them something. And you as parents might be quite excited. I said, right, we're going to Vegas or we're going to Ibiza. That's where we're going to do this kind of stuff. This is what Decapolis was like. It was renowned as a place of Roman Greco entertainment, if you like. And even there, Jesus had begun to teach and open his followers' minds that God was at work and God was going to do something significant. And again, we see there's a large crowd turned up, which is a bit of a shock. Because if you went back to Mark chapter 5, when Jesus turned up there the first time, he was approached by a man who was possessed by an evil spirit, and he was uncontrollable. And Jesus cast out these evil spirits into a herd of pigs that ran down a hill into the lake of the Sea of Galilee. And the locals in that area were so traumatized, they said, "Jesus, get out of here. We can't cope with that demonstration of power." But now, instead of pushing Jesus away, these people are welcoming Jesus. What was the difference? Well, the difference was probably the demon-possessed man. Because that demon-possessed man said to Jesus, "Please, can I come with you? Can I be one of your followers?" And Jesus said, "No, I want you to stay. I want you to come around the area of Decapolis, and I want you to tell your story of what God's done in your life." So now, a number of months later, maybe even a year or so later, suddenly, these people, after hearing the testimony of this man, after hearing what God had done in his life and transformed his life, they're saying, "We want to know more about Jesus," in the midst of their equivalent to Ibiza or Vegas. How exciting is that? And they've turned up and they've been with Jesus for days. And so in showing they were sticking with Jesus, they are now beginning to feel stuck themselves. We read in verses 2 to 3. "They've been here with me," Jesus said, "for 3 days. They've nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a long distance." So we see these people, they have stuck with Jesus. They've come to see him, used up all their physical resources to hang out, to listen to his teaching, to discover him. And now Jesus is saying, they have stuck with me, I want to stick with them because they are stuck. They can't make the journey home. Physically, they're not going to make it. They haven't got enough physical supplies to get home safely. So Jesus takes this preventative course of action to try and save and help these people. So it's this marvelous picture, isn't it? Who should we show compassion to? Jesus starts to give us some guidelines. Show compassion to those who are sticking with you. These people stuck with Jesus, and Jesus said, okay, as part of my response, I'm going to stick with you. These people were physically stuck. They were going to collapse. They didn't have the food they needed in order to get home. So there is a physical response by Jesus as well. And as I'm thinking about compassion, as I'm thinking about what we do as a church, I think what a great guidelines these are. Where people, if they come, wherever they're at on their journey, if they're seeking God, if they're sticking with us, if they're trying to discover things about God, let's show compassion. Let's give time and effort and energy to such people. But secondly, if people are physically struggling, if they are stuck, if they haven't got food on the table, we also should respond as part of the Jesus response or way, if you like. And this is why we run the community grocery. Even if we don't want tin peaches, we still want to give away food to help feed people. And up to 100 people each week on the west side of Bury are benefiting from what we're doing, from your generosity. And this is part of what shapes our thinking. This is the guidelines for compassion. So that's the first step. The second step is that as we start to show compassion, let's tap into God's supply, not necessarily just our own. We read in verses 4 and 5, his disciples replied, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? Jesus asked, how much bread do you have? 7 loaves, they replied. So I love this response from the disciples. It used to be that comedy sketch, didn't it? I think it was David Williams used to sit there at a computer and people used to ask him questions and he said, the computer says no. Any question that anybody asks when they're trying to get a break on it, the computer says no. This is what the disciples are doing, isn't it, here? The computer says no. Jesus, I know you want to feed these people, but we're in a wilderness. We're good Jewish boys. There's no kosher food out here. What are we going to do? There's no chance. Now, this is fascinating because a number of months earlier, Jesus had fed 5,000 people. And you think, what's wrong with these disciples? Jesus has done it before. Why can't he do it now? Well, perhaps the difference was when Jesus did it last time, it was amongst God's people. It was in Galilee. It was in a holy place amongst holy people. He's now in Ibiza amongst the pagans. And they think, whoa, he ain't going to do it here, is he? Because sometimes we're like that. Oh, yeah, God will answer my prayers if I'm in a church building. But in my workplace, I'm not sure Jesus can do that. But actually, Jesus can. Because that's part of his supply. The circumstances, the setting doesn't impact this. And somehow we've got to change our thinking. Instead of saying what we haven't got, we need to start looking at what God has given us. It might be pretty minimal, like just 7 loaves compared to a big crowd. But it's that emphasis on let's focus on what God has given us. So often in our culture, it seems to be this grab what you haven't got, this sense of extraction, exploitation, empire, rather than looking to use what we've got to nourish, bless, be open-handed and generous to others, because that's what compassion is. That is God's way, God's supply, if you like. So Jesus gets them moving. Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, he thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples who distributed the bread to the crowd. So here we see, if you like, a model response. Jesus isn't bothered by what he hasn't got. What he does is focuses on what they do have. And what does he do? He said, thank you, God, for what you've given me. Now take, multiply, and bless it. And he goes into action in faith, and the food starts to be distributed using the disciples. Continues as well. A few small fish were found too. So what did Jesus do? So Jesus blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. Follows exactly the same practice again. Whoa, some fish have appeared from nowhere. Brilliant. Thank you, God. Bless this, multiply it, use it. Come on, let's get it out there. Do you see the supply of God? Do you see the system here? Instead of moaning and whinging, I haven't got this, I haven't got that, I need more money, I need more talent, I need more. No. We just say, God, this is all I've got. I thank you for it. And if you can multiply and use it and make a difference, then so be it. This is the picture Jesus is giving of his supply. And what was the result? They ate as much as they wanted, and afterwards the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 men in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. Do you see what happens when we tap into God's supply? People are satisfied. People get more than enough. We have a God of abundance. This picture of 7 large baskets. These baskets were ones that were like man-sized baskets, if you like. They were huge things. And this was the leftovers. We have a God of more than enough, a God of provision, a God who can do more than we can imagine. And as part of his supply, yes, there is a physical provision here, but actually there's a real spiritual provision here that's just hiding away in the numbers. 2 key numbers emerge in this particular miracle. You see the number 4, and we see the number 7. Numbers in the Bible are incredibly symbolic and powerful teaching tools, particularly for the Jewish people. And the number 4 is the number of the Gentiles. It's the number of non-Jewish people. It gets this picture of the 4 corners of the earth. Wherever people might be distributed, that's the number 4, or the 4 points of a compass, north, south, east, west. This picture of non-Jewish people. So basically, God is saying, I'm going to work here in this Gentile, pagan setting of Decapolis with pagan, Gentile, non-believing or allegedly non-believing people here, and it's tied up in this number 4. But we also see the number 7, the number of bread, loaves of bread, and the number of baskets collected. 7 again is another symbolic number. Cast your mind back to creation. After 7 days, God rested. Why? The sense of completion. That's what the number 7 is about, completion. But also there's a nuance in terms of a pagan setting, because 7 is the number of nations that was driven out of Israel in the time of Joshua. You can read about that in Joshua 3, verse 10. 7 specific nations were identified and driven out. And now with Jesus coming in, with his new kingdom in compassion and power, what's happening? He is inviting those nations back to himself. And he's saying, you can be part of God's goodness, God's provision, because I am more than enough. How exciting is this? God, and through Jesus, isn't just more enough for his own people. He is more than enough for the whole world. This is the message. This is the point that Jesus is trying to teach his disciples. His disciples were starting to get it in their own setting amongst his own people. But now we're seeing that Jesus is more than enough for the whole world. And he's inviting people in to come and join his kingdom work. This is part of the supply of God. It's so much bigger than what goes on in this building. It pours out into Bury St Edmunds and beyond. This is where God's compassion and his supply gets so exciting. And so let's tap into this a little bit more with our final point. What about God's sympathy, or the sympathy, of people? Immediately after this, we read in verses 10 and 11, he got into a boat with his disciples and crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. When the Pharisees heard Jesus had arrived, they came and started to argue with him. So after this wonderful miracle, this wonderful provision, you can imagine the conversation in the boat as they're going across the lake. Wow, God is doing so much more than we can imagine. God is doing bigger stuff. And there's this wonderful party waiting for them at the other side. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, the people who are passionate about the law of God, knew their Bibles inside out. They were absolutely delighted to see Jesus, weren't they? Do you know that? As soon as he gets off the boat, they start to argue with him. I must admit, I feel a little bit like reminiscing about being a naughty teenager when I read this. I don't know if this was your scenario. Perhaps you came home a bit late, mum and dad waiting for you. What have you been up to tonight? It's almost this picture, isn't it? These super spiritual religious leaders. Jesus, what have you been up to? You haven't been back in that pagan land again, have you? You haven't been doing miracles again, have you? And this language that's used, testing him, they demanded that they show a miraculous sign from heaven to prove his authority. When he heard this, he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why do these people keep demanding a miraculous sign?" That word testing him, it's the same word that was used when Satan turned up to test Jesus. How scary is that? The people who know their Bibles inside out, who try and follow the laws of God, can somehow be more closely associated to the purposes of the devil than of Jesus. When they're asking, "Come on, give us a miraculous sign." Jesus had already healed people in front of them. He'd fed people in front of them. He'd calmed storms. He'd done all sorts of things, but this apparently wasn't enough. Somehow they wanted a miraculous sign from heaven. In other words, they wanted something to happen with the sun or the moon or something like that, so that they could then think, "Oh, well, maybe Jesus is somebody special." But they were so blind to who he is and his purpose to include the whole world in his activity, they just demanded something beyond what Jesus was prepared to offer them. You see the response of Jesus, sighed deeply. The sense of disappointment comes out. Why do you keep demanding a miraculous sign? It's just asking that why question when we're meant to live by faith, not by sight. When he'd already given them so much, it's like, where's the trust? Where's the belief? Finally, in verses 12 to 13, we read, "I tell you the truth, I'll not give this generation any such sign." So he got back into the boat and left them and crossed to the other side of the lake. Quite amazing when you think we've got a God of all compassion, a God of love, and that was modeled by Jesus. And yet, at this point in time, what happens? His compassion runs out. He says, "No, enough. I'm drawing a line. Your lack of sympathy towards me, your lack of sympathy towards God's work in this wider world, do you know what? I just can't work with that." And Jesus just gets back into the boat and leaves them. The only sign they were left with was abandonment by Jesus. He said, "If you're not sympathetic to what I'm trying to do, in particular to reach out to this world, then do you know what? I'm out of here." And this is so sad, because these people, they had such a spiritual heritage. They knew their Bibles inside out. They were God's chosen people, yet they missed the purposes of God in and through Jesus. They missed his mission. They missed his heart for the world. Those people outside of the people of God, those outside the church, or whatever we want to call it. So sad. And yet, on the counter to that, such hope. You can imagine the Roman readership reading this account from Mark, thinking, wow, there is hope for us. Jesus has a heart for people like us. We're outside the people of God. We're not religious like them, yet God still wants to include us, and God still wants to move amongst us. We are included in God's agenda. And of course, that's exciting for us today, because we're thousands of miles and thousands of years away from this, and God still has a heart for people such as us. So in conclusion, what's God saying to you today? As we think about compassion, we think about channeling our compassion, what's our response? What's our action going to be? Is there someone who's sticking with you maybe? Someone who's searching or exploring? Will you show some compassion and help them on their journey? Or as you look around, you see people who are stuck. Maybe the cost of living crisis has become too much. Maybe the utility bills have been too much. Do they need some help? Or maybe there's someone sick who can't get beyond whatever they're facing. Can you show them some of this compassion of Jesus? And as we step out and start to show compassion, can we draw upon God's supply, not ours? Can we stop saying, well, I haven't got this, I haven't got that, the computer says no, and start to say, okay, God, this is what I've got. If you can take and use it, please make a difference. Well, thirdly, maybe we need to tap into God's mission anew and afresh. Discover this new heart for the people that God has. Discover a new sympathy for the mission and plans of God. Victor led us earlier into communion. And we see today through that and through this story, Jesus is the bread of life. He's come to provide nourishment and blessing, not just to us, but to all people, if they're open to the things of God. So 2 challenges hit me straight away. Am I modeling, exemplifying this version of compassion of Jesus? Am I open-handed, generous? Or am I extracting? Am I exploiting in what God has given me? But secondly, you might be one of those stuck people. You might say, David, I've come here because I'm stuck. It might be physical, it might be spiritual, it might be emotional, it might be social, I don't know, whatever it is. Can I say to you, Jesus is more than enough for you. Whatever you're stuck with, God can help you with that. The bread of life can sustain you in that situation. Have you said yes to Jesus? Have you said yes to the wonderful provision and compassion of a God? He wants to include you. You don't have to be super religious or anything. This story emphasizes you can be included. But have you said yes to this wonderful good news of Jesus? Let me pray, and then we'll hand back for a time of worship, of response to our great God of compassion. Lord Jesus, I thank you, you're all-powerful. But I also thank you that you're a God of compassion and love. There's plenty of powerful people in our world, but they don't show a lot of love. You're this wonderful combination of compassionate power. You can make a difference. You can turn things around. You can redeem. You can restore. And you long to include people who are perhaps feel excluded, who perhaps feel on the outside. And yet the reality is, in your heart, they're more in than they could ever know and imagine. Lord, anybody who's sat here or anybody who's watching online who feels excluded on the outside, give them the courage to invite you and ask you into their lives so they can be included and part of your family. And help us as a church to extend that invitation. Help us not to write people off just because they're not religious or don't come to our church or don't do things the way we do it. Lord, help us to be compassionate, sympathetic people to your plans and your purposes and to get on agenda with you and get this good news of you out there that you want to save, that you are more than enough. If people will just say yes and respond to you. Help us with this task, we pray. Holy Spirit, come upon us anew and afresh. For your sake and for your glory, we ask this. Amen.